So welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm Victor Curran, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord. Our group plans and presents events that educate and celebrate the people and events that have made Concord a center of American independence and imagination. And when people talk about the Transcendentalists, the first thing that usually pops into people's mind is their love of nature. And of course, that's an important piece of it. But the other piece of it is that the Transcendentalists were consciously changing the thinking of their Puritan ancestors. The Puritans had the idea that people were sinful by nature. And the Transcendentalists rejected that idea. They embraced the idea that people are innately good, and that if you give people the resources and the societal support, they will not be sinful. They will be good. And one transcendentalist in particular, Margaret Fuller, was a vocal advocate of prison reform for just that reason. And so that is a natural segue into tonight's topic. Our speaker that I'm happy to welcome is Sam Williams. Sam is the executive director of Concord Prison Outreach. He's co-chair of the Community Advisory Board for Northeastern University's Institute of Race and Justice. Over more than 2 decades in the nonprofit sector, he has served as Chief Operating Officer of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, Senior Program Manager for both Summer Search Boston and the Safe and Successful Youth Initiative of the Commonwealth Corporation. He served on the board of directors of Action for Boston Community Development and as an appointed member of the Executive Office of Public Safety of Massachusetts Racial Profiling Task Force. He's a native Bostonian. He's a graduate of Boston University with a master's degree in city planning. There will be a Q&A at the end of Sam's presentation, and you can just use, your audio is going to be muted, but you can use the chat thread, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to open the chat window and type your questions. So please join me in welcoming Sam Williams.
Good evening. I'm gonna go into shared screen mode. And thank you for the generous introduction. And I want to begin by just saying how I'm excited and honored to be here with you tonight and to share with you some of my thoughts and insights and research around these two very important subject matters. Actually, you'll see as I go through this PowerPoint, there's a third subject matter, which is civil rights, that I think are so closely related to these two subject matters. I want to just lift up a few things about myself. Currently, along with being the executive director for the Concord Prison Outreach, I am also a certified yoga instructor and a certified meditation instructor. So a large part of the work that I do is healing. And I have a personal vision in life to heal not only the earth, but every human being that's living on the earth. So that's my personal vision. I want to heal every human being along with the earth in my lifetime. And I just want to say, as I go through these slides, the concept that I'm sharing with you are just my critique of social justice, prison reform, and some historical kind of movements that have occurred both in the past and the present. But by no means am I a pessimist. I believe in the inherent good and worth in every human being. So as you can see from this first slide, I really chose this because this really speaks to, just the desire to want to not be limited by material or institutional influences. So keep your coins, I want to change, I thought was a very relevant first image to share. I want to just quickly, I won't spend time on this, but the quote, "A picture is worth 1,000 words." This picture actually is an art piece that was created by a friend of mine who never made it out of the Department of Correction. And so there's a lot going on in this picture, and I wanted this to be one of the earlier images that you remember as we go through this presentation. So how to define an effective strategy? And this is a quote that I kind of wrote myself. When a strategy produces the desired results intended, it's fair to say that your strategy is effective. And I want to just continue to kind of emphasize effective strategy produces the results that are intended. And so if you're using a strategy that's not producing the results, then it's time to reevaluate. I wanted to begin by why social justice and prison reform in the United States. And I wanted to start with these two images. The Birth of the Nation movie was a very iconic, social, technologically tool that was introduced in the early 1900s. And then the other image of the eugenic tree was also represented just the values and the beliefs and the attitudes. So when you talk about prison reform and social justice in America, these two images are very iconic to what it meant both then and now as we are living in the 21st century. Want to lift up some historical social justice barriers and efforts. And I won't spend a lot of time on these, but I think many of you know that the original civil rights law was written in 1875, and it was rejected for about 89 years. The 19th century eugenic movement was an attitude and a belief around what they call well or good genes. There was this idea of some human beings were more superior than the other, and I won't get too deep into that, but it really shaped the social justice movement's both efforts and barriers. At the time, the UNIA, which was the largest Pan-African movement during that time, was being led by Marcus Garvey, and it had an amazing impact. In the United States, there were over 200 satellites locations that was a part of the UNI movement. So there was a lot of social justice and social action occurring during that time, although there were barriers. We know that laws and legislation acted as major barriers. The convict leasing, sharecropping, the KKK, which was related to that, the Birth of the Nation video, the Jim Crow laws, those were all barriers to social justice. The Red Summer, which occurred between 1919 and 1920, 1921, was a it was both violence and social justice erupting in over 30 cities across the country. We know that the Brown versus Board of Education was a major civil rights, social justice initiative that injected energy and optimism into the country at the time. And the new civil rights law, which was passed, although it was the same language from 1875, which I said it took 89 years to legislate, also was another one of those social justice energy forces that injected optimism during the time. The Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, barriers at the time, the assassination of Malcolm and Martin, and then the Black Panther movements. So these are just some historical, both barriers and efforts to the social justice and civil rights movement. I wanted to lift up these two texts because one was written in 1944 and the other was written in 1965. And both of these texts really kind of described both the social problems and challenges of the time. They were both written probably about 20, 22, 23 years apart, and really speaking to conditions in America. And these conditions were also the underlining motivation and energies around social justice and prison reform. My purpose for going through those is, again, going back to strategies, failures of tactics, failures of strategies, failures of vision. I want to come back to that again. So part of why I want to talk about failures is this is a picture of myself. I was born in 1964. I was born in Honduras and came to the United States in 1968. And I like this quote, if you can imagine it, you can create it. So you have a young child, very innocent and very pure. But because of what I would call many systemic failures of the past, I inherited a lot of the conditions that pre-existed my life coming here to the United States. And I want to share with you what some of those conditions were, and I'm going to tie them to social justice and prison reform. So this slide gives you a snapshot of my first 20 years of my life. And I called this slide the consequences of failed strategies. So between the ages of 0 and 5, there were some early childhood traumatic things that happened that as a child I was not aware of, but it didn't understand what happened. My mom's coming to the United States, leaving me and my brothers and sisters in Honduras. That was a traumatic experience that I didn't understand until I got older. But between the ages of 5 and 10, I was living in Roxbury. And you can see that, what I was exposed to during this part of my life had a significant impact on my life, witnessing 2 women fighting and cutting each other with knives, attending a funeral of a 14-year-old who got killed and not really understanding or being debriefed around what death was. There was a lot of fracture at home. I was molested as a child, never met my dad. And more importantly, as a 5-year-old, right, there was a lot of uncertainty and disconnection and social isolation. As you go to the next section of my life, between 10 and 15, there was a lot of bullying, ostracizing. It was a time when I started to experiment with drugs, and my identity and negative self-images of who I was started to develop. Between 15 and 20, which is the late adolescence growth development period, a lot of things occurred. And this is where you see systems beyond me really having a larger impact. At this time in my life, I spent some time in the Department of Youth Services. I spent some time in the House of Correction. And eventually at the age of 19, I was sentenced to an 18 to 20 year sentence into the Department of Correction. Things that were going on in my mind, in my body, in my life, substance abuse. I was one of those students that were a part of the busing desegregation experience back in the in the late 70s. I went to South Boston High. It was chaotic, it was confusing, it was traumatic, and there was no explanation to why it was that folks in the community of South Boston was treating children the way they did who just wanted an education. I had an older brother that was murdered, and I was involved at that time with street life and crime. So when I look at all of the things that happened within the first 20 years of my life, I associate these personal failures with the larger systems that weren't available to support me throughout this time period. And I'm not blaming it on anyone, and I take full responsibility for my behavior, my actions. But the education system, the family system, the community system, there were systems that were supposed to be there for me as a child that failed me. When you look at the largest systems that the earlier strategies were not able to effectively impact, the most glaring example to me was the wealth gap. And I took both of these slides out of research that was done over 30 years that really looked at the different wealth gaps between affluent and non-affluent. And you can see in the slide to the left, the tax benefits for those who are affluent versus working family is not comparable. And for that gap to exist, obviously, there's a lot of factors involved. And then when you look at the slide to your right, and you have 400 of the richest people in the country, controlling the type of resources and economic resources versus the 6 million people on the other end, obviously the scales are not even. And my summation for these 2 slides is the conditions both in my life and the economic conditions of America today has a lot to do with the strategies of the early 1960s and prior. And I don't believe that those strategies were effective because if the strategies were effective, children like myself across the country and families like many of the families who are struggling today would not have the type of challenges that they're facing. Some of the other struggles of the early 19th century social results, urban renewal, I won't get into that, but it was a national initiative that really spurred redlining across the country as a result of the interstate highway system being built. The GI Bill, which created across the country all of the suburbs that exist today. I think many of you all might be familiar with the term white flight. It was when many folks who were living in the central cities and cities were condensed, decided to move out of the cities. But for the GI Bill, it provided subsidized federal loans to veterans coming back from war, but limited those loans to only white veterans and not Black veterans. Prison privatization, the war on drugs, the crack epidemic, black on black homicides, 2.2 million adults incarcerated at the time from the 1980s to the present, was over a 790% increase. And in that earlier report with the wealth gap, it talked about it would take 228 years to achieve wealth parity with white families today. So African Americans and Latinos, it would take close to 228 years to achieve a wealth parity. And so when I think about social strategies and social justice movements, again, if they were effective movements, they would have developed the results that they were intended. And when I look at these conditions, I don't see the results that I think the initial ideas were intended to bring forth. So now I'm going to fast forward quickly into the 21st century, social justice and prison reform. We've seen over this time the Million Man March, the Million Women March, the Million Youth March. Right now there's reparation movements, Black Lives Matter, prison abolition movements, Free Her campaign, Me Too, civil rights activism, critical resistance, transformative justice, restorative justice, race, equity, diversity, and inclusion training. There is a plethora of social justice and reform activities and movements occurring today. The question is, are they effective? Are they being effective? Are they bringing about the necessary changes intended? I will try not to answer that right now. But I like this definition of prison abolitionism. This concept, the movement that is trying to think beyond prison as a tool to solve society's problems. So this vision of looking beyond institutions to solve society's problem is a beautiful concept. Unfortunately, and again, I'm not an optimist. I do believe that much change have occurred. I do believe that things have improved, but on a scale, I don't believe the results are measuring up, because incarceration rates continue to be high. Poverty and wealth gaps continues to grow. Medical conditions for Blacks and Latino and minorities are dismal, especially during COVID. Home business ownership for minorities still lagging behind. Education attainment for Blacks are still lagging behind. Violence and Black on Black murders are still soaring. It might not be that evident here in the Massachusetts region, but in other major cities across the country, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, New Jersey, Black on Black murders are still soaring despite COVID and all of the reports that crime is going down. My belief that part of the results not being possible is that there's a lack of national coordination, which also relates to funding limitation. There's this severe social competition among community leaders, Black churches and elected officials. There's a decentralization of leadership, too many voices, no clear articulated direction. And these are just my opinions. Most social justice and prison reform initiatives have short lifespans because of a lot of the things that I just lifted up. And evidence of sustainable success not documented beyond materialism. So beyond the physical attainment of jobs, of properties, I don't think there's evidence that really documents the sustainable success of all of those 21st century social justice initiatives. I wanted to lift up these three movies, which I thought were excellent. I was really hoping that they would bring life and breath into the consciousness, into the energies of folks involved in prison reform and social justice. And I do believe that they have, but again, I don't believe that the strategy and the results at the scale of the change that's necessary in today's society. My opinion is the results of those earliest strategies are still creating school to prison pipeline. And as we know, over the last couple of years, the Black on Black, the Black Lives Matter, and all of the energy. And these are faces of men and women, children, fathers, mothers who lost their lives to police shootings. And so for me, when I think about all of the strategies that I just mentioned, the reparation, prison abolitionism, and I still see the results of school to prison pipeline, police shootings, I question how successful and effective these efforts are. Again, just my opinion. The revolving door of recidivism continues to revolve despite COVID, despite all of the campaigning that's going on about defunding police, defunding prisons, addressing issues of solitary confinement, et cetera, et cetera. The revolving door of recidivism continues. Back to that earlier slide, failures of tactics, failures of strategy, failures of vision. I believe that a successful strategy produces the intended results. And if the strategy is not producing the intended results, then the strategy is not effective. And so my premise is that the strategies that I've tried to describe earlier are making changes, but the sustainable changes that are necessary on the scale necessary, I question. I come back to this quote, but now it's a quote from another child. If you can imagine it, you can create it. And so I am going to share with you what I can imagine. And I'm going to share with you what I know that I can create. So my solution, what I call a new holistic educational approach to prison reform and social justice. I think first and foremost, we're not only dealing with a pandemic around a virus, we're dealing with the health pandemic. And so I believe health empowerment should be a major calling to all of the systems in our country. And what I mean by health empowerment is that we educate men and women to truly understand that they can control their own destinies despite the systemic social barriers that might be in that empowerment. Health empowerment is a self-directed approach to truly understanding yourself holistically, healing the mind, the body, and the spirit. There's no cookie cutter approach to this. And so I think that each individual will have to be educated on a level where they truly understand their minds, their bodies, and their spirit. I believe a global education approach is necessary, and one that is self-directed and not a national handicapped institutional approach. Because when you are learning because you're excited to learn, when you're learning to expose and to uncover, when you're learning to question and to dismantle and to look beyond. It's the type of learning that has no barriers and no boundaries. And when you're looking at these concepts around prison and reform and social justice beyond a national lens, I think it gives you a broader scope for creativity, innovation, and I would believe effectiveness in an approach to bring about change. I believe that there needs to be a higher level of consciousness and education around neuroscience and medical science. And this goes back to the health empowerment component, because the more one understands all of the many facets of how the brain works, from the central nervous system, the limbic, the autonomic system, how to control self-regulation, how to control energy, how to, to be able to tap into higher levels of insight. You're talking about understanding the mind and the body at the very deepest levels. Addressing trauma, which is what I described in my personal experience, and how early childhood trauma shaped and impacted my life in some very, very debilitating ways. And how when trauma occurs early in one's body, there's this thing that's called prematuration brain damage to the prefrontal cortex. And educating families, men, women, about the importance of early childhood development, adolescent brain development, I believe is a way to empower people to be able to control their lives and the support and the development of their children. Synthetic drugs, toxic chemicals of all kind, food and pharmaceutical, are very debilitating and helps to create the type of deterioration in the physical body and the immune system and the respiratory that, again, depletes people in their energy, depletes people in their ability to think on higher cognitive levels. And so really educating people about food, educating people about synthetic and toxic drugs, I think are critical. Physiology and anatomy, I talked about that earlier, and what it means to truly understand self, your central nervous system, your gastrointestinal system, which is the microbiome, your autonomic nervous system, which is connected to the CNS, the GI, the vagus nerve, the prefrontal cortex. All of these systems are connected to the ability of each of us as human beings to be empowered, to be in control, and to really be able to bring about both the social changes in our lives, but also the social changes, I believe, on a community, regional, and a national level. Transgenerational trauma, which is speaking to a lot of the earlier efforts, a lot of the historical challenges, and how trauma, similar to values, beliefs, attitudes, and perceptions, are passed along generationally. And so my belief is that with men and women who are incarcerated today in the Department of Correction, it will be important to develop a type or an approach, a curriculum, an educational series that really provides them with the type of holistic understanding of systems, of education methodologies and pedagogies, of what they can control within their bodies and their minds, and how it relates to larger societal challenges that they'll be coming into society dealing with. I've been out of the criminal justice system for 25 years. And when I went into the criminal justice system, I was 19. And again, not knowing all of the things that I just described to you in my strategy. And over the last 25 years, I've adopted an understanding of all of these things that I'm describing. And all of these things that I'm describing are what I would call part of my strategy, right? And I can say that the strategy that I've used over the last 25 years have produced the results that I intended them to produce. I've not dealt with the criminal justice system in the negative ways that I've dealt with them 25 years ago. I've been involved in so many local, national, regional initiatives, educating, training police officers, state police, and Boston police, and a wide array of subject matters. I ran after school programs and summer employment programs and domestic violence centers, and participated in a wide array of different types of research. So I say that to say that for me, when I describe effective strategies, I relate effective strategies with results. I can say in my own spirit, my strategy has been effective because over the last 25 years, obviously, I've become a different human being, both in my body, my mind, and my spirit. I believe that social justice movements and prison reform movements, although they probably on some level adopt a lot of these concepts, I think they need to take a much more deeper look at the non-physical conditions, meaning the body, the mind, the spirit, and all of the intricacies around medical conditions, mental health conditions, and trauma. And so I present these concepts and these slides to you as my solution to improving social justice and prison reform, not to take away from all of the great work and efforts of those who came before me, but to say that a lot more needs to be done. The results and the impact that needs to happen is not on the scale that it needs to happen. And we have to go beyond the physical, tangible, material way that we look at this work and really delve into the spirit, the mind, the body, healing the heart, healing the mind, healing the body, healing the earth. And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Sam. Could you talk a little bit about how some of these principles are reflected in the work that you're doing in Concord Prison Outreach now?
Yes. So with Concord Prison Outreach, we provide prison education. And we have about maybe 22 different programs. I really believe that the social emotional programs are the ones that will really have the deepest penetrating impact on the men and women who are on the inside. You can imagine that the last 2 years of being in prison and dealing with the uncertainty, dealing with the fear, dealing with limited movement, the suspension of visitation, the suspension of programs have really severely traumatized and debilitated a lot of the men and the women. And I am anxious, and we all are anxious to get back in to extend all of the programs, but really, really, really bring in yoga, bring in meditation, bring in anger management, bring in some of these social emotional programs. I want to bring in some, programs around nutrition. I want to bring in obviously some programs that really address early childhood trauma, to at least get men and women on the inside to start being more familiar with their bodies, more familiar with their minds, and more familiar with the capacity that they have within themselves to control much more of their lives than they believe that they can, although they're in that institution.
Are you able to have some influence on the organizations and people that run the institutions in areas like, for instance, if you're incarcerated, you have pretty limited choices as far as nutrition. So if you want to have an impact on the nutrition that folks are getting, that conversation also has to take place with the people who are running the prison and who are providing the food in the prison.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And that could be a challenging one because when you start to talk about food, you're questioning who the DOC choose as a contractor and a vendor, because all of their foods come from outside vendors. But I do believe that there is a way to provide education. And I'll give you an example. When I was on the inside, and at the time, I'm not an Orthodox Muslim today, but I was practicing Islam, and the Muslim chaplain who came from the outside, he came in and he was a very, very lovable, caring man, but he was studying this thing called tib. In Islam, it's called tib, but it's herbology. And at the time, he was teaching us about digestion. And he was teaching about certain foods and how certain foods break down in the body and digest, right? And part of Islamic fasting, Islamic practice is fasting. So I learned about, digestion. I learned about fasting. At the time I stopped eating meat while I was on the inside. And so there's some basic ways in which you can pass along information to men and women on the inside who are interested. With the DOC as an institution, I think it's a conversation, and that might be around, being able to talk about the food products that they bring in, sugary products with high sodium. That's a different type of conversation, but I do believe it's possible. I meet with administrators from the DOC, obviously via Zoom, once or twice a week. So I am making some headway in being able to have conversations. And I don't think that would be an adversarial conversation to have with the DOC. Again, they're one of our major partners, right? So I would have to approach it in an educational way that both benefits DOC as an institution and the inmate population. But I do think there's strategic ways that you can push nutritional education and even possibly some of the products that are being brought in.
I had another question from a couple of things that you mentioned in your talk. You talked about the lack of nationally coordinated initiatives for social justice. And on another slide, you mentioned the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
And it got me wondering to what extent social inequality is driven by the fact that public K-12 education is funded by local property taxes.
Yeah.
And do you think that cutting the link between school funding and local property taxes nationwide would be doable and would be move us in the right direction of reducing inequality?
You said cutting the link to
cutting, in other words, funding public education in some other way than local property taxes.
Yeah, I think it would require a national conversation. Geographically across the country, some regions much more resourceful. Some states have and towns have different uh, uh, laws that were created over generations. I do believe that if we looked at education across the board, it's working for some and not working for a lot. And really, and this is what those two articles, the books, the Moynihan Report and the America Dilemma, was really describing. What 100 years ago. That no, not 100,
Getting
70.
there.
Yeah, but it was describing everything that we see today, from unemployment to education to poverty, right, to crime. And here we are today, 100 years later, and these conditions are still prevalent, and they're still. And so I do believe that um, thinking more creatively. The sad thing is that we have an abundance of data. We have data that really describes the problem, that describe strategies that made some progress, strategies that didn't make progress. And to the extent that we are able to use that data, to the extent that we're able to coordinate on a level where we're looking at all human beings, all educational systems, and really trying to figure out how to best support them, will determine whether or not, kind of like what I was saying, the strategy is effective. I still don't believe at the largest scale possible that earlier strategies have been effective. Yes, change have been made. Yes, some people have made advancements, but when you look across the country holistically, that number is not as promising as people might believe.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple more questions from Shelley Hawks. Um, One is actually, and they're related in a way. Is there a movement towards allowing incarcerated people to have access to computers under certain circumstances? And the second question, which isn't unrelated, is could you describe what opportunities there currently are for incarcerated people to earn degrees?
So let me start with the last. Well, okay, the last one.
Okay.
Um, I am a recipient of the prison college program. I got a bachelor's degree, my bachelor's degree of liberal arts, through the prison college program while I was on the inside. I got my master's degree in city planning um, since I've been home at BU. Unfortunately, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they reduced the prison college program to a 10-month certificate, or to a certificate program. So it was, at least in Massachusetts, I know places like New York and other states, they still have strong prison education programs. But in Massachusetts, right now, you have remedial education, you have basic education, you have now this prison college program, but it's certificate based. I really felt like that was a major loss, because there are many individuals like myself who took advantage of the prison college program and who are now home in community doing some amazing work with youth, with families, with policies, working with both city government and state government. And I do believe that education is an X factor. And I didn't know at the time when I got involved in the prison college program how it would benefit me, how I would use it. This is when I was on the inside. I just had the spirit to persevere, the spirit to work hard. And it was something that I wanted to do, but didn't know how I was gonna use it. And lo and behold, I am who I am today, 26, 27 years out, having all of the professional experiences. You know, I've taught as an adjunct at Boston College. I've taught as an adjunct at Wheatlock. I taught as an adjunct at UMass Boston actually this spring. You know, so I've had opportunities to teach in college environments. So I think, unfortunately, college education is not available, but I do still believe that the general basic education is still critical. The reading, the writing, the developing the vocabulary, those are foundational tools that even if you perfected and mastered those tools while you're in, you will be a lot more prepared to come out and step into higher educational opportunities. In regards to technology, the system is still kind of slowly behind. What I do know is that they're moving in the direction of setting up Zoom capacity in all of the facilities so that some of the programs that were being offered in person can now be taught through virtual learning platforms. But again, that's more programmatic, it's more institutional. You know, it's not that men and women will have access to Zoom. It's not that men and women will have access to computers. Unfortunately, right now, they're still using typewriters. They have been at MCI Norfolk, they have been, the DOC has instituted these tablets. They're not kind of as sophisticated as, you know, the tablets, you know, the Mac and what do you call the Mac tabs, you know,
Like
but the
laptop
tablets, yeah, they're not as sophisticated as that, but they're able to access music. They're able to do some level of emailing on it, which I was surprised. And so the DOC has brought in, and I don't know if these tablets are being instituted across the board. I know before COVID, when I was at MCI Norfolk, I know that folks at MCI Norfolk had the tablets. The tablets, you know, are not set up where they'll be able to have Zoom accounts. So there is some gradual progression around technology, but right now, the primary technology use is those tablets, the Zoom, which is more centralized, and if they are computers on the inside, they're probably only able to use Word, and probably don't have access to printers. So it's still very archaic.
If you're in one of these certificate programs that you talked about, do you get college credit? Like, if when you get out, then you decide, okay, well, I want to finish my degree. Do you have some? Can you apply some of that credit?
No, so that is what the biggest loss was. So, like, for example, when I came home, I had the college degree, I had the bachelor's degree, but I was also fortunate enough to have taken maybe 4 or 5 graduate courses. A couple of them were direct study courses when I was down at the pre-release. So I was able to, when I decided to go get my master's degree, those graduate level courses were credited, right? With the reduction of the program today, the courses are being offered as college level courses, but they're not credited. So you're not going to be able to take anything that you learn on inside and and have it credited to not even associate degree at a community college. So that was one of the major losses in the prison college program being reduced to it's a certificate program now. You know, you get a certificate of achievement, certificate of completion, but you would be starting from ground one. You would have to figure out your own financial aid. You'd have to figure out all of those things as if you were, you know, someone out in society trying to get in school for the first time. So that's where the barrier would be for men and women coming out who wants to transfer their educational energies into higher education once they come home. It's a major barrier. It's a major loss. Yeah, but that's the state of
that seems so backward. Did they give any reason for why they did that?
You know, I'm not exactly sure. I just remember I got out in 1997, literally finished my sentence, 97, 96. And I remember a couple of years after I got out, I heard the announcement that prison education programs were being shut down. At the time, you had to apply for FAFSA. You had to, so there was federal funds tied to, you know, getting into, and at the time there was UMass, there was BU. So you had to go through some of the similar paperwork, but you were automatically accepted for the FAFSA, for the scholarship, because you was indigent and you were in prison. So I don't really know what so I'm believing that there was one, you know, some type of federal funding implication.
It's just
And
about
I think,
money.
and I think with BU being a private college, I want to say I want to commend BU because colleges like UMass, colleges like Massasoit, colleges like Curry, and colleges like Curry, UMass, Massasoit. There were about 4 other colleges that were heavily involved in the prison college program when it was flourishing. And all of them walked away. And BU stayed involved for about maybe, you know, 10 years or so after those schools stepped away. And so I commend them. And so I don't know if, BU stepping away, if it had anything to do with their budgeting of staff, their financial commitment to prison education, because there was a couple of people who were coordinating the prison college program from BU. So there was some probably budget, staff, funding implication. And I don't know I know that there's still a connection to BU. I know that they're still involved with the prison education, but not on the scale of accredited degree like the one that I got in my undergraduate degree. So I got a legitimate Boston University bachelor's degree of liberal arts. If I was to show it to someone, you wouldn't know that it was a degree that I got from MCI Norfolk. And it looks no different from my master's degree that I got from BU attending while I've been home.
Thank you, Sam. We got time for one more question, and this is a good one. This is about Malcolm X. Some people listening may not realize that Malcolm was once in MCI Concord, and believe he was on the debating team. They debated and actually won against Harvard and MIT. Could you say a few words about that?
Malcolm is my mentor. I've never met him in the physical flesh, but I live with him daily in my spirit. He and his life is what inspired me to reinvent myself. Malcolm's thirst for knowledge, his thirst for education, his ability to transcend adversity and barriers. Malcolm had a lot of issues with, early childhood experience, drugs, streets, violence, kind of similar to my life, and was able to use prison as an education platform to change his life around. And so, Malcolm was a self-directed learner. And today I'm a self-directed learner. I love, learning independently. I love creating my own subject matters of study. It's why today I study neuroscience, I study epigenetics, I study trauma, I study physiology and anatomy, I study human migration patterns. I create my own curriculum. The things that I look into are what excites me to understand the world. And Malcolm is someone who I think, similar to Nelson Mandela, who examples of what's possible beyond a tragedy and an unfortunate life situation. I believe that there are many, many Malcolm X's in our prisons across the country. I believe that prison education and adult volunteers who go in, I think, are the folks who can help individuals to tap into what I would believe that capacity that every human being has within themselves. Can I close with a poem?
Of course you can.
So do we want to close now?
Go ahead.
All right. So in the spirit of Malcolm X, social justice reform, and prison education reform, I'd like to share this poem, which is called Human Potential. And my definition of human potential is that each of us as human beings was born with the natural ability to do great things in our lives. And it doesn't matter what we look like, the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, our circumstances and situations. Each of us as human beings was born with the natural ability to do great things. And the poem goes like this: the body is like a vessel. If it's pure, it will remain safe. But the turbulences of life's deceptions can influence actions to be unchaste. Thinking is a method, and through its knowledge, we'll learn the rules. Diamond, emeralds, and rubies in this world are known as jewels. A comparison for us to learn from. In all of our efforts, there should be a rule that the value of our minds are greater than any of those jewels. If perchance you can correct me, just reflect on what I say. Stones of values had limited meaning, but the human nature is here to stay. Mankind's existence comes from progress, and this progress will help us all to rise above the heights of God's creation. The more you want, the more you'll strive. Liberation is no real factor, because if you're mentally and emotionally free, you need no walls. Self-determination of one's purpose will keep you healthy and standing tall. Get a grip on where you're going and focus in on every need. Step by step, we must always be planning. To conquer life, we'll need a strategy. And again, a strategy that is effective, that produce the desired results. Thank you. I appreciate you for allowing me to share.
Thank you. I think your reading of Malcolm X has been an inspiration to one of our listeners who is asking if you could recommend any books by or about Malcolm X.
Yes, there's a new book that just came out called The Dead is Arising. It just came out. And the reason why I think it goes deeper into family members and other people in Malcolm's life beyond the autobiography. There are many books, but it just came out this year. It's called The Dead Are Rising. It's I would definitely recommend that. It just takes Malcolm, it talks more about his moms, it talks more about his dad. It gives more detail than the Alex Haley version of Malcolm X's autobiography. I would recommend that book.
We'll look for that. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And happy holidays and happy Thanksgiving. Hope to hear more from you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful.